recorded in the beautiful mountains of British Columbia. Welcome to
Friends on Horses. Welcome back to Friends on Horses. We've got a pretty cool guest today. We're going to be talking nutrition. And would our lovely guest please introduce themselves and what they do?
Hi, everybody. My name is Jana Hunter. I'm from a little town called Harris, Saskatchewan. My business is called Copper Cricket Equine Care. I'm a barefoot trimmer. I also do hoof boot fitting, custom nutrition consulting, and hay sample collection.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much for joining us this morning. I know that there'll be a lot that we'll kind of cover today, and I know both Emma and I are really excited to talk with you, just launch into the nutrition pieces. I wonder if we can kind of back up a little bit and maybe talk about just how you came to equine nutrition and kind of what your journey was there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started riding lessons when I was 5 years old, and ever since then I've been pretty horse obsessed. I always knew that I wanted to work with horses, but I didn't really know exactly what facet. So I guided trail rides for years. I've also done training and colt starting for the public, and I've always had my own horses as well. So a few years ago, I had my own little herd of horses, and I was pretty sure they were going to be my keepers forever. And then one day I was on Facebook scrolling along, and I saw a horse for sale. And he was absolutely gorgeous. But aside from that, there was just this pull I felt. And I kind of thought, well, I need to explore this more. And no, I've got my horses. These are the ones I want. I'm not shopping. I don't need this horse. But yeah, he just really pulled on my heartstrings. So long story short, I hooked up the trailer and I went down to have a look at him. And he was from quite a sizable herd. And he really badly needed a trim. His hooves were in pretty bad shape. And I test rode him, and he was foot sore when I test rode him. But I thought it kind of stood to reason given the situation, and I thought I'd get him home and get him trimmed and he'd be good to go. So at the time I had an awesome farrier who was a really good friend of mine, and she was doing a fantastic job on his feet, but he just wasn't coming along quite as quickly as we would have liked him to. So she suggested that I learn a bit more, and then I could help maintain his feet between her trims. Well, I started going down that rabbit hole about hoof care, and the more I learned, the more I wanted to learn. Like I was dreaming about trimming feet. It was just insane. And I realized how passionate about that I was. So it kind of snowballed from there. I started taking over trimming my own horses, building on my education, and then I got to the point where I started trimming client horses. Then the more client horses I trimmed and the more feet I saw in all different living situations and breeds and disciplines, I started to piece together how much nutrition played a role in not only hoof care, but whole horse care. So then I kind of brought in the nutrition aspect of it, and yeah, now between the hoof care part of my business and the nutrition, that pretty much consumes my days, and I couldn't be happier with that.
Aw, that's great. And I'm assuming that the nutrition piece came after the foot piece because there's something that you saw. Like, was it about solving problems in the horse's feet, or what did that look like for you? How did that transition happen?
Yeah, I just started seeing lots of feet that were flared and long run forward toes, underrun heels, thin soles, wall separation, thrush, weak frogs. And it took me a bit of time, but I came to realize, and I often tell my clients, I can't trim my way out of a nutritionally weak foot. Try as I might, even if we trim, every 3 weeks, every 4 weeks, I'm never going to get over that hump if there's something nutritionally compromising the feet.
And so for listeners out there who might be kind of hearing this information for the first time, what would you kind of be looking for to know that it's not a structurally compromised foot, but a nutritionally compromised foot?
Those things kind of go hand in hand. So hooves can be structurally compromised because of the nutrition aspect of it. So a couple minerals that are very, very important for tissue strength are copper and zinc. So they help form the connective tissue in the hoof called the lamina. And if they're copper and zinc in the diet are always going to be in deficit amounts. And to kind of branch off on another little aspect, iron competes for absorption with copper and zinc. So iron is generally always in excess in the diet. Copper and zinc are always generally deficit to some degree. And we also have to up the amount of copper and zinc fed to compensate if there is high iron in the diet. So a lot of times when I see really flared hooves, I know that the lamina isn't doing its job. It's not able to hold on tight because it's compromised. And a lot of times that's from the lack of strength in the connective tissue. It can only hang on so long before gravity and everything kind of takes away.
Interesting. And do you find that your clientele, well, probably if they're coming to you, they want kind of a whole picture approach, but do you ever struggle with that with people who just want to do the trim, but they don't want to do the work with on the diet end of things?
Oh, absolutely. And I went in pretty gung-ho off the start, and it would weigh on me pretty heavy when people weren't receptive of that piece of it. But I've kind of got to the point where I've learned to pick my battles. And if I can help with the feet, that's great. If they're interested and if they're on board with the dietary stuff too, well, that's awesome, because then I can get the whole entire horse working as it's supposed to work and to optimal health. But yeah, I do certainly have clients that I just show up and I trim their horse's feet, and they don't really know all of what I do just because I haven't wanted to totally overwhelm them. They're just happy that I show up on time and I do a good job. So
you take those, like, bite off those bite-sized pieces at the beginning, I'm sure, with people.
Totally.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just said totally, for sure.
Yeah. Now, are there any other indicators in the feet that you wanted to talk about with relation to horses' diet? Or
so yeah, my trim style is maybe a little different from some. Most people know that horses' feet need to be trimmed when they get long. Well as just addressing wall length, I also trim to build strength and integrity in feet. So the front half of the foot is bone. It's the coffin bone, or P3. The back half of the foot is soft tissue. Now, I've come to learn and realize through different clinics I've taken and my own personal trimming that we can actually build and develop the soft tissue in the back part of the foot. And that's a pretty powerful thing. So many horses have issues like navicular, caudal heel pain, thrush, where they avoid loading the back part of their foot. So that soft tissue in the back of the foot, that's designed for shock absorption. And a lot of horses land toe first. And when they land toe first, all the impact of the landing goes up the bone rather than being absorbed in the digital cushion, the shock absorption part of the hoof. So there's so many injuries caused by that concussion. And personally, this is kind of a strong opinion, but I believe horses that land toe first are not truly sound. So I like to trim to build that digital cushion, to encourage heel first landings, and to build the strength in the hoof. So in order to do that, that kind of encompasses a few things. That encompasses trimming to stimulate wear in all the right places, frequent trims. I see the biggest results in my client horses that are on 3-week trim cycles, and diet also plays a huge role. So that's what I'm working to build towards, and all those things are kind of needed for the situation to be perfect, for the planets to align.
So thinking about the nutritional component, because that's of course a large part of what you do as well, when you're working with clients and working from that trim perspective, what other pieces are you bringing in terms of your knowledge of nutrition? So maybe, we've talked about the iron and the zinc and the copper, but how do people know where to start with all of that?
So we need to start with what the horse is getting for feed on a daily basis. The only way to know for sure what the horse needs is we compare what their requirements are against what their feed provides.
Interesting. Okay, so what the requirements are compared to what their feed provides, I'm guessing that's like the requirements as in, do they work 3 days a week? Do they work 5 days a week? Are they metabolic? You know, what do their feet look like? What does that look like to you, or what are you looking at?
Yeah, exactly. So all the calculations are based upon the NRC, the National Research Council's book, Nutrient Requirements for Horses. And there's all different requirements, like you say, Emma, based upon age, workload. Yeah, I also definitely factor in if there's underlying conditions like an insulin-resistant horse or PPID or anything like that also plays a part. So basically, I first determine what they need to consume in a day energy-wise, how many calories they need. And then I look to the hay to see how many calories the hay provides. So then they need, you know, X amount of hay to fulfill their calorie requirements in a day. And then we look to, okay, that amount of hay contains how much copper, how much zinc, how much protein. So then we can determine from there, based upon a hay analysis, if the hay is meeting their requirements, where it's meeting their requirements, because some things it may be, but certainly other things it's not going to be.
I'm very excited about getting my nutrition report back from you. Yeah, for our listeners, I've got my hay analysis done and got my information back, and I've sent it off, or I will be sending it off to Jana here pretty soon. And I'm very excited to start that process. Now here is a question that might seem, you know, basic, but for some of our listeners, it's, you know, it's an interesting question. So what does ideal nutrition look like?
So ideally, I would like to see horses on a forage-based diet, whether that's hay or whether that's pasture. Of course, most horse people know that not all horses tolerate pasture, so that needs to be factored into that equation. But yeah, forage-based diet that's low in sugar and starch. And then I usually recommend either plain beet pulp, no molasses added, or Timothy hay cubes soaked as a carrier to add the mineral supplementation needed, along with vitamin E and essential fatty acids.
Maybe we can just back up a little bit, because I know the concept of hay analysis is something that's very popular in our area, and there's lots of people that do test their hay every year so that they can go through this process. But I wonder if we might be able to talk a little bit more about, like, how the heck do you test your hay and what's involved in that, and who do you send it off to, and all of those little pieces, because it, you know, even here, I feel like it's something that's just kind of surfaced within the last kind of 3 to 5 years in the equine world.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm super excited that more and more people are becoming interested in doing hay testing. I think for a lot of years, it was something that we just didn't really know about. And we looked at the hay and said, well, is it dusty? No. Okay. Is it nice and green? Yeah, that looks pretty nice. It smells good. It's got to be good. But the only way to know for sure what's in hay is to have a hay analysis done. Other than those things I just mentioned, there's not much we can gauge just by looking at it. We don't know what the sugars are. We don't know what the protein level is. We don't know where the major and trace minerals are at. We don't know about digestibility, palatability. So hay analysis is crucial for knowing those things. Now, when you send in a hay analysis and get it back, it's going to look like it's in another language. And most people won't know how to decipher that, which kind of adds to the intimidation level of it. But yeah, there's certainly people out there like myself or other nutritionists that can help read it and determine what it means, what your horse needs, and where you should be looking for supplementation. And I just find doing that you're able to fine tune exactly what your horses need. You're not adding fillers and maybe minerals that you don't want that are further going to throw things out of whack. Yeah, like a lot of ration balancers really aren't balanced. So it's just a lot more ideal to have a look at your hay, fine tune exactly what your horses need, and then you can feed just that. And a lot of times it's actually more cost effective to do that route as well.
And again, for pardon me, for people who haven't ever tested their hay, like, are you going out? Are you just getting a flake of hay and putting it in a bag and sending it off? Like, what does it kind of look like to test your hay?
Yeah, so I have a core sampler, and I think there's feed stores out there that'll rent out core samplers as well. Core sampling is really the simplest way to go about it. Because we want to collect from as many bales as possible to get as comprehensive a view as possible. So I generally recommend collecting from between 15 to 20 bales. And we want it to be a core sample. We want it to be from the middle of the bale so that there's no contamination from the outside of it. So yeah, core samplers are really ideal for collecting the samples. But if a person can't get a hold of a core sampler, you can just open the bales and take a sample from a little bit further in. I generally fill up about a medium Ziploc freezer bag, and that's enough. It really doesn't take them much to do the actual sample. We just want it to be a very varied collection from a few bales. So I do have my core sampler, and clients within the area that I travel to, I will collect samples for them. And then clients outside of that area, I can coach people on how to collect a sample and how to mail it in.
So you bring up a really interesting point, because I think, when we talk about hay testing, you want to get a very broad sample of the hay that you have. And I think there's really this myth out there that, a hay bale is a hay bale. And, if it's coming from the same field, it's, the same kind of content. And like you say, kind of visually, if it looks good, it is good. But I wonder if you can talk about all the different factors that go into what will actually show up in the hay during that sample.
Yeah, so the reason we want from a few bales is even if it's from the same field, theoretically it's going to be fairly similar. But if a person only collected from one bale, if there happened to be a molehill under that bale, so when the hay was cut, a bunch of dirt was scraped up that was like a lump above the ground surface, then it would be very full of dirt, and then we would probably see it being exceptionally high in iron and whatever the soil in that area contains. So some circumstance like that, we would see more of the soil composition coming through than what the hay would actually contain.
Does weather impact it at all, or kind of like soil content in the soil? Like, is the hay, the grass in the hay, actually impacted by what's in the soil as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I often tell people, I have quite a few clients with metabolically sensitive horses, and most people know that with metabolically sensitive horses, you either can't have them on grass and pasture, or you have to manage it very, very closely. So a rule of thumb I like to tell people is stressed grass will always be higher in sugars. So grass is stressed during drought, grass is stressed the first frost in the fall because it's trying to stay alive despite the cold weather coming. So it pumps up the sugar production kind of as a self-preservation method. But yeah, I know a lot of people say, oh, well, the cattle graze that pasture down and it's just barren, so I can kick my metabolic horse out on it, now it's safe. And I say, well, no, even though there's not a whole lot there, the grass that is trying to come back, it's going to be crazy, crazy high in sugar because it's trying not to die. So yeah, spring grass will always be higher in sugar, stressed grass, and the first frost of the fall. Weather also does definitely play a part. I recommend people, if at all possible, cut hay kind of on a cloudier, cooler, overcast day, preferably in the morning, because the sugars do rise throughout the day in the grass, and they're at their peak in the afternoon, especially on a hot sunny day. So it kind of goes against what most hay producers want to do. You want to cut it when it's hot and sunny so it dries quick and there's no chance of moisture or rain. But yeah, it's certainly ideal to cut it kind of on a cloudy or cooler day if possible.
It just goes back to what you're saying about like a hay bale is not a hay bale is not a hay bale, right? Like all these old notions that we have about an orchard grass mix or Timothy hay. Someone might just say, oh, Timothy, it's just always really low in sugar. But there are so many factors that go into whether or not that bale is high sugar or not, or what it has in it. So it seems like hay testing is kind of a necessity for our captive animals, especially. You probably wish everyone got a hay analysis, eh?
I really do. Yeah, I mean, there's no better way to optimize nutrition and health of the horses. And to me, it's just such a simple thing to do. Like, yeah, you have to do it once a year because your hay does change from year to year. But I mean, to do it once a year and to be able to fine tune it down to an exact science. Like, we do so much for our horses through different therapies and different therapeutic products and infrared blankets and magnets and pulsed electronic healing and supplements and custom tack. People spend so much money trying to get their horses feeling and working their best. And I think a lot of times maybe missing the mark, that their basic dietary needs are not being met by their so-called complete feeds. So yeah, absolutely. I would love everybody to get a hay analysis done because it's just so eye-opening that it could be such a simple thing that so many people don't realize.
And I noticed earlier that you mentioned when we were talking about kind of what an ideal nutrition looks like for your horse, you're like, lots of forage, vitamin E, and I can't remember how you put it, but like a good omega balanced, like a flax oil or something along those lines. You can correct me in a second here, but you didn't mention, like, you didn't say, oh, and a bag of minerals. Right? Like, you're probably in your mind, it's like if someone's not going to do a hay analysis, they need to check these boxes, but why add extra into the diet that they might not necessarily be needing? Or it sounded like you're not super into people adding extras until they have the information. Is that right?
For the most part, yeah. I think I kind of touched on minerals there, but it sort of skimmed over. I said the beet pulp or the Timothy cube soaked as a carrier for your loose mineral. Mm-hmm. So for me personally, I feed loose minerals. I go out and buy the individual minerals and I measure out the amounts I need and I weigh them. And then I just know, like, every day I need an eighth of a teaspoon of this and a quarter teaspoon of that. And I mix it into my cubes every day. So that's generally what I recommend people do. You can certainly get custom blends made. There are feed stores that will make a custom blend based upon your hay analysis balancing report. But feeding loose minerals, I just love doing it because I can customize it. If you have a mixed herd, you can customize it for each horse. Or if it changes from year to year, you don't necessarily have to go out and buy a whole new product. You can just kind of tweak the amounts that you're feeding. So yeah, a lot of the products on the market, the so-called complete feeds and balancers, really don't truly balance. Like, every hay is going to be so different in what it contains for minerals. And from what I've seen, there's always something in the hay that's not ideal. We kind of always have to work with something that's not ideal. And okay, what do we do about that? So it's pretty hard to just go to the store and say, oh, well, this says it's going to balance my hay, when hays can be so completely different from each other. And while some types of grass and legumes do certainly share characteristics, that we can't reliably count on that for the mineral levels and the protein levels.
Right. So someone, I mean, again, in an ideal world, they'd go get their core sample or their hay sample from a few different bales of whatever they're feeding their horse. Then they'd send it to the hay analysis people, do their science thing. And then they get that report back that they're like, oh my goodness, this looks like gibberish. And then they send it to you. And then you break it down for them and probably have recommendations, you know, as to what you would be feeding their horses based on their situation. And then they can either order those minerals themselves or, and as you said, weigh it out, or send that information to someone who can pre-make that for them. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So I kind of fine tune my recommendations too based upon somebody's situation. So if they only have one horse and, you know, whether they board or whether it's at their house, if they have the capability to go every day and feed it, I may recommend something different to them than somebody who has a boarding barn and 20 horses of all different needs. So yeah, I give all the options, but I also kind of break it down and say, well, if I was you, this is the route I would go because. So I don't leave people hanging. You know, the hay analysis is kind of gibberish when they get it back and read it. And from the same perspective, my balancing report can kind of be gibberish too. It's just a lesser degree of gibberish. So I want to stick with it and I offer support. And if anybody has any questions or whatever, I certainly give advice on, okay, this is the route I would take from here, and certainly contact me if you have any questions. And I've had people contact me and say, hey, I found this product, what do you think of it? And I help them compare it against their balancing report and show them why or why not it may or may not work.
I wonder if you could go into a little bit more detail, like you already touched on kind of iron and zinc and copper, and that those are really important minerals. I wonder if you could go into a bit more detail about how those minerals kind of work in the horse's body in terms of supporting things like foot health and overall nutrition health, and if there's any other minerals out there that are also maybe impacting that balance for the horse that you know, equine enthusiasts out there should be mindful of when they're thinking about balancing the nutrition for their horse.
Absolutely. So balance is the key word there. All the minerals kind of play and interact with other minerals, and certain minerals compete with other minerals for absorption. So, you know, again, to go back to hay analysis, it's the only way we're going to know what levels of minerals are in hay, what they're already getting, so what they need. So for your iron, you want to have 1 part copper for every 4 parts iron. And then you want to have 3 parts zinc for every 4 parts iron. So as well as making sure they're getting the amount needed on a maintenance level every day based upon their weight and their workload, we also need to factor in if the iron is high, we're going to need to increase the copper and the zinc even more to compensate for the high iron. Because if we just add the dietary levels needed daily, but your iron is crazy high, your iron is quickly going to override those amounts that we're adding, even though they should be enough, just because the iron can be so much higher. And iron can be a very big problem in the horse's diet. It's the only mineral that there's no active excretion pathways for. So oftentimes people ask me, well, what if I give too much of magnesium or too much calcium or too much this? With other minerals, it's not really a problem. We can usually supplement the opposing minerals to counter it, but with iron, it is a problem because the excess amounts can't be excreted by the body.
So with a horse that might have too much iron in their diet, what kinds of things would you be seeing?
With iron overload, it kind of shows that in a lot of the same ways as a copper and zinc deficiency. So I might see really weak hooves that are badly flared out and cracked and chipping, a dull hair coat, bleached out hair coats a lot of times. If you have a black horse that's super, super faded to kind of a reddish color. So a lot of times we see it through the hooves and through the hair.
Now, it's interesting thinking about horses as an individually, and I'm sure when you're looking at a horse's requirements, let's say you're working with someone who has a horse that's an athlete, right? You might be recommending that they have a little bit more forage because they might need more calories, let's say, or whatever else that looks like. Now, bringing that question back to kind of the mineral end of things, are there any times of which, you know, an athlete might need more, I don't know, zinc, copper, magnesium than the same horse on the same property eating the same hay who gets exercise 20 minutes 3 times a week? Like, does that ever affect their minerals that they need, or is it just calories that you're looking at that point?
That's a great question. Yeah, minerals are absolutely affected as well. The main things are going to be calories, protein, lysine, making sure those needs are met, because horses in work are really going to use up a lot more of those things and require those at a higher level. But the minerals do rise as well for horses in higher levels of work. And also something else to touch on is growing horses, young horses that are growing, pregnant mares, lactating mares. So we need to change the requirements for all those different levels as well. And I factor that in with my balancing.
And you just brought up a new one, lysine. So what does lysine do as part of all of this? How does it fit in?
Alrighty. So lysine is an amino acid, and protein is made up of different amino acids. There are certain amino acids called limiting amino acids that how I learned and how it kind of makes sense to me is when amino acids are put together, it's almost like stringing together beads on a piece of cord. So limiting amino acids, when you get to where you need to put a limiting amino acid onto your bead string, if you don't have one, that whole string is taken apart. So limiting amino acids are super crucial to have in the diet. Some of them the horses can synthesize on their own, some of them they can't. But lysine is calculated as a percentage of the protein when I do my calculations. So if the protein is high enough in the hay, there should be adequate lysine in the hay. But that's one of the things that I look into.
And I'm guessing lysine is one of those that can't be synthesized, so it would need to be added in if it's not present in ideal quantities within the hay.
Exactly, yeah.
And then we're kind of jumping all over the place, but this is what happens when the conversation gets interesting. There are a few products out there that are quite popular right now. Things like, well, I won't say any brand names, but products that include, say, flax oil, or include, say, turmeric, right, to support healthy joints and manage inflammation and irritated tissue and joints, and include, you know, and affecting the feet. What are your thoughts and feelings on those kind of the additional extra support? Let's talk about maybe something like turmeric right now. Like if you get your hay analysis and your hay is perfectly balanced, should you need a product like a turmeric product, let's say, or do you then look at, okay, this horse is having these other issues or is in extra work and could use a little extra help here? Like, as a nutritionist, what's your perspective on that? That wasn't a very well put together question, but I'm sure you'll get something out of that.
Yeah, so I mean, there's people who swear by those products, and there's people who think it's just kind of a snake oil scheme. And I think the key thing there is your hay will never be balanced, and minerals play so many important roles in the body, and there's minerals that are absolutely crucial for joint health, And if those minerals are in deficit in the hay, that's where a person needs to look before adding a joint supplement or an anti-inflammatory. Because to me, it's just so much simpler than that. You need to go back and fulfill the core requirements. And then absolutely, if you're still having problems, you can explore other routes. But I think a lot of people kind of don't realize that if those core needs aren't being met, there's going to be things lacking for sure.
And that kind of brings the conversation back to these other therapy techniques. You were talking about people getting like the magnetic blankets and all this other stuff because they're struggling and really trying their best to give their horses what they need if they're, trying to manage a problem and not seeing the results. Are there other things that you see out there that you wish people were more aware of? If they brought it back to nutrition, those problems might be helped or solved?
Yeah, absolutely. The main thing I see is a lot of inflammation in the body. When I'm trimming horses, I see a lot of horses that hold some degree of inflammation that I think the body is pretty smart, and I think inflammation, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It certainly serves a purpose. It helps to protect and to heal and to rebuild. But when we're adding ingredients to the horse's diet that promote inflammation, that's not going to be a good thing. And to go back to the essential fatty acids, omega-3 is an anti-inflammatory, omega-6 is a pro-inflammatory. So the reason I recommend feeding flax is because flax has a really nice balance of omega-3 to 6 and is the closest balance of omega-3 to 6 as grass is, which would be natural in the horse's diet. There's other oil and fat products out there that are higher in omega-6 than omega-3. And some people feed them and love them and say, oh, they make my horse so nice and shiny and they've developed a top line and blah, blah, blah. But they do certainly add inflammation to the body because they're higher in the omega-6s. So for that reason, I really like the flax oil. Flax oil, however, doesn't have a long shelf life, but you can also feed ground flax and have the same effects.
So I'm sure there's listeners out there that have been kind of thinking about this and that are maybe still a little bit skeptical of getting a hay sample and are kind of thinking, okay, so if everything has a secretion pathway except for iron, if I just watch the iron, can't I just go out and buy a balanced supplement and add that in and the horse will just secrete what they don't need? What would you kind of say to that train of thought?
There's going to still be things that won't be provided in adequate amounts and things that they're going to get way too much of. So for an example, alfalfa hay tends to be quite high in protein, quite high in calcium. And talking about the mineral ratios, when we look at high calcium, we have to balance the phosphorus to the calcium and we have to balance the magnesium to the calcium. Phosphorus can be super hard to supplement because it's not overly palatable and it's at such a low amount, a low elemental amount that we have to feed a lot of it just to get a little bit of it. And magnesium is crucial for muscle health. So if a person's feeding, I don't recommend feeding alfalfa hay as the horse's entire forage diet, but if a person's feeding an alfalfa or an alfalfa mix, they're going to be getting tons of protein, tons of calcium, and I can guarantee not enough phosphorus, not enough magnesium. So it would be quite detrimental to go and find a product that has more protein and more calcium and add that to the diet when that's not the things they're needing. They're needing more phosphorus and more magnesium. So the more we add the things we don't need, the more the things we do need are going to be out of balance.
And this can be a really overwhelming process to people and feel kind of out of reach. And I want to encourage people to get your hay analysis done. It's actually not very expensive. And if you send it to someone like Jana, that's also, you're getting a lot of bang for your buck. And And in the end, when I decided to do my hay analysis and get my nutrition looked at by you, Jana, this year, I kind of looked at it, looking at my year. I'm like, it's actually a whole lot less expensive to get that process, go through that process than it is to like be kind of looking around in the dark, right? Like trying to figure out what it is my horses need and buying a whole bunch of products that they might just be peeing out by the sounds of it, if it's, in excess, or it might be messing with their calcium, protein, whatever, right? It's can feel really overwhelming, but if you get help, like I don't have to know how to read my hay analysis, and I don't have to know what my horse needs, because if you get your analysis done and Jana looks at it, then, and tells you what to do, you can just do that. So
yeah, for sure. I'm happy to walk people through all that, and through the different choices and options from the feed store and how to go about it. Kind of an interesting thing is I had a balancing client recently who was feeding a bagged product just to kind of add cool energy. It had some minerals as well, but it was $30 a bag. So I did the balancing for her, and then I actually did a separate spreadsheet. She has quite a few different horses, and she said, well, the easy keepers, I'm feeding the smaller amount, and the harder keepers, or the horses in work, I'm feeding a bit more. And she was feeding it under the recommended feeding dosage. So I broke down for her, okay, this is what a feeding of this, the amount you're feeding, this is what it actually provides the horse. And when she looked at that against her balancing report, she went, oh my goodness, like this really doesn't add much, and it's super, super expensive. And that's just kind of a key point is, she thought it was beneficial, but she's paying $30 a bag for this stuff, and it's really not adding anything notable to her feeding program.
I have a selfish question, if I can ask that.
Absolutely.
So as someone who does a lot of clicker training with my horses, I feed them a lot of cookies, and I try and find feeds that are fairly low sugar, high fiber feeds to give them, because they'll be getting a lot of handfuls in a single training session. Or if I'm working with a behavior client and we're working through some behavior issue that requires, an association with a positive experience, food's just a really easy thing to add to that. What if you had to give your horse treats? Like right now I'm giving them what would you call it? Like a hay extender for senior horses. So it's like I'm feeding them hay pellets, right? Instead of a high sugar cookie. Is that an option that makes sense to you? Like, what would you do?
I'm not a treat person, so I can't really speak from that perspective on it. But yeah, that would certainly be your best option, is just to feed like a hay cube. Certainly look for something that's low sugar, that doesn't have molasses. I prefer to avoid ingredients like corn and soy, because those are going to be higher inflammatory ingredients. But basically just low sugar, no molasses. I don't know if you've ever experimented with like vegetables and stuff, but there's certainly veggies that you could cut into little tiny pieces, like if your horse likes celery or something like that, that would add a bit of fiber and be very, very low sugar. So
I have not yet given my horse celery. I'll see how that goes.
I was thinking the same thing. I'm like, carrots, apples, beets, even celery? That I have not tried the celery before.
Yeah.
Yeah, carrots and apples are going to be a bit more high in sugar, and in very small amounts. Won't be terrible, but I did hear recently of a story of a horse that struggled with chronic laminitis, and they thought they were doing everything right for him, and he was at a boarding barn, and then a few months in, he wasn't really progressing, and they realized that somebody at the barn was feeding him 2 tiny little apples, like not even nice full-sized, apples that we'd want to eat, but just like tiny little crab apple sized apples every single day. And that was enough to keep his laminitis ongoing. So it's certainly something to be mindful of, even if it's just the tiniest bit of sugar. Depending on the horse, it can still definitely trigger. But there's lots of lists online of safe feeds, safe vegetables, safe fruits that we can add that are lower in sugar. I have a client with a metabolically sensitive horse, and I was there trimming one day, and she went into his stall with a grocery bag, and I said, "Oh, what have you got?" And she said, "Oh, I went to the grocery store and I bought this discounted lettuce." And I said, "What?" She said, "Yeah, he loves it." And she had a bag of salad mix, and she dumped it in his feed bucket, and he just went to town. And that's something I would have never thought of, is to feed your horse lettuce. But yeah, even something like that can be a good option.
That's a fun idea. I'll have to experiment with my horses. I have one that's a really picky eater, and maybe I'll try making him a salad one of these days and see what he likes.
I just had this image of you, Emma, with your clicker and a head of lettuce giving out the lettuce leaves.
I might, if I try that, I'll have to make a video and post it on our Facebook page for sure.
Positive reinforcement.
Yeah. Oh dear. Oh boy.
Well, we've covered a lot already. Jana, is there anything that we haven't touched on that you wanted to make sure we discussed?
Yeah, there's a couple things yet. So with sending your hay analysis into a lab, it's pretty important to make sure you send it into a lab that does equine testing. Lots of labs do testing for dairy cows, for milk production, because feed in the dairy industry is also a very, very closely scrutinized thing. And I have certainly got hay analysis back that are more geared towards dairy. And I could be wrong, but from what I've seen, they generally don't report trace minerals on those ones. So just ensuring that it's kind of an equine-based analysis that they're doing, and that trace minerals are added on as well.
Do you have a couple of places that you recommend people use for their hay analysis?
I really like using A&L Labs. They're out of Ontario, and they have a web page, and you can print the submission form off the web page and just mail the submission form in along with the hay sample. And just on a side note with that as well, for people mailing in their own hay samples, you want to make sure you mail it in kind of as soon after collecting as possible. Like when I collect them and send them, I try to do it the beginning of the week, so that hopefully it gets to where it's going by the end of the week and it's not sitting in a depot over the weekend or anything. I had a sample go in last year that my client's dad was going to mail in for her, and he forgot it in the vehicle for a few days before he sent it. And I got the hay analysis back, and it was just completely out to lunch. So inevitably hay does have some moisture in it. And I'm guessing the moisture in the bag just kind of started to ferment as it was sitting in the hot vehicle in summer. So we want to try to get them sent in as soon as possible after sample collection.
And so I sent my hay sample in pretty quick. And the people that I sent it to, there were a couple of options that they had. So, you know, there was option A, which was basically just looking at sugar, fat, protein. And I know a lot of the locals around here, they're just very sugar focused. So that's what they use. They don't look at the minerals. And then they had like option B, which was, you know, your minerals, and then option C, which was your minerals plus selenium. And then they had options for, you know, they had their like horse trainer option report that included a whole bunch of things that they felt like horse trainers would want. I'm assuming that, well, obviously you want people to include minerals in their hay analysis. Is there anything that you wish that people would include in addition to your minerals, proteins, fats, sugars?
Not really, no, just making sure the trace minerals are added on. Like every hay analysis I've seen has reported the major minerals, but it's the trace minerals, the copper, zinc, manganese, and iron that we really need those to be reported. So sometimes the trace mineral package is an add-on, but like you say, the horse trainer package or the more comprehensive packages should have trace minerals. It's just good to ensure that they do for sure.
Now, once people have their hay analysis back and you've given them this amazing program to follow and they've been following it, as a trimmer, how quickly do you usually start seeing changes in the foot?
It completely depends on the horse and the living situation and what they've been getting fed. If what they've been getting fed is a drastic change from the new feeding program, we'll probably see it quicker and we'll see a more visible change. But generally within a couple months or so, we start to see the hoof wall coming in tighter. And generally the hoof wall always grows tight from the top and has a good lamellar connection from the top. So the telling sign is when the hoof wall is usually about a quarter of the way down, a third of the way down the hoof from the top. That's where if it's going to start flaring out, we generally see it from that point, because it does start growing with a tight connection, but without those minerals and without the connective tissue being healthy, it can only maintain that connection for so long.
All right, good answer. Now, Jana, anything else that was on your list that you wanted to talk to our listeners about today?
Yeah, salt. Salt is another super important topic. So I always recommend feeding loose salt. Salt blocks are more designed for cattle than for horses. Cattle have rougher tongues, so they can get enough off a salt block, whereas horses, in my opinion, can't really fully fill their requirements just from a salt block alone. So I feed loose salt in along with my minerals, and some people like to offer it as well, so horses can self-select it. But yeah, I always recommend feeding loose salt over a salt block or a salt and trace mineral block. And on a side note, trace mineral blocks generally have kind of the same as a ration balancer. They have added iron, which we don't want, and they have very, very low amounts of the minerals we do want. So I generally recommend staying away from a trace mineral block because it's not really adding anything of benefit to the diet, but it is adding ingredients we don't want.
And are you talking like loose salt, like table salt, like a tablespoon of table salt into their mash?
Yep, exactly. So I buy it from the feed store. So I buy it in big bags. I think they're like a 20 kg or 25 kg bag. And it's very inexpensive. It's about $9 a bag and lasts me a couple months. So it's very cost effective. But yeah, it's essentially just loose white table salt.
Well, that's nice and easy, eh?
Totally.
Mm-hmm.
And is that something that you would offer free choice as well for horses, in addition to what you're adding to their bucket?
It certainly doesn't hurt to offer it free choice. I offer enough to my horses' buckets that I don't offer it free choice. I've tried before and they just ignore it. So yeah, I offer enough in my feed that I know I'm meeting their requirements. And then another facet of that is when horses sweat, they lose minerals in their sweat. So we need to replenish those minerals as well. So when I do the hay analysis balancing for people, when I do them for horses in work, I add on an extra set of calculations for if your horse is sweating, for every hour of sweat loss, you also need to add this on top. So there's the column of the base requirements, the base maintenance requirements for every day. And then there's a column for every hour of sweat loss. This supplementation is needed as well.
Now I'm getting super excited about getting my nutrition report back from you, Jana. It's so interesting. Okay, I also have donkeys. Is there anything that you notice typically that donkeys need that is quite different than horses?
Oh my goodness, yes. I love donkeys so much. I have such a soft spot for donkeys. They're just my favorite.
Me too.
And it makes me really sad when people just kick them out on pasture with their horses and treat them as if they're a horse, because even though they look similar-ish, they're very, very different in their dietary requirements. So donkeys originally were desert-dwelling animals. They're not meant at all to graze on nice, green, lush pastures. You know, what they scrounge for forage and kind of eat the scrubbier, more sparsely vegetated areas. So for them to get the sugar and the calories that a lush field of grass provides is just way too much for them. And consequently, I see a lot of donkeys with metabolic issues that are grossly overweight and huge fat deposits and big cresty necks. And all of that is just mismanagement and, you know, feeding practices that don't benefit them.
So that would mean, okay, take your donkeys away from your horses, get them off pasture. Exercise is a piece of that. Probably a lower sugar hay, because from what I understand, they're really good at breaking down the food that they eat better than our horses. Is that kind of along the lines of what you're talking about?
Yeah, their calorie requirements are generally less because they're smaller, and usually they're not worked with the ways we keep donkeys in this part of the world. So they really don't require the high levels of energy and the high sugars. So yeah, certainly a lower sugar hay. Straw, actually, they do quite well on straw if they get straw during the day, and just a small portion of their forage is hay. And then like horses, they do require balanced minerals as well. So I do that for their weight, factoring in that their weight is going to be less than a horse, their weight, and generally they're at maintenance, which is a non-work level.
Right, right. And I've heard, is it barley straw? I've heard on different forums, and I was wondering if whether or not this is accurate. This might land into the whole, you know, every bale is different because every pasture is different, or the time of day they're cutting their straw is different. But I have heard that certain types of straws are better for donkeys than others. Is this kind of old information? Do we want to be looking at the same things in the straws we do the hay, or can someone just buy a bale of X type of straw and assume it's better for their donkeys?
No, it's certainly good to look at the straw as well, because like you say, it can definitely vary. And also how the straw was handled has a big impact on it. We want to make sure it's not green feed. We want to make sure it doesn't still have the grain in there, because the grain would be very, very high in starch and detrimental to them. And we also want to look at, if it was a grain crop, how it was harvested. Nowadays, grain farmers, to speed up the process, often desiccate their crop, which essentially means spraying it to kill it so it dries down quicker so they can harvest it quicker, because we're dealing with, you know, different weathers and shorter growing seasons. So if a crop was desiccated, if it was sprayed to kill it before it was harvested, before the grain was harvested and the straw baled up, it could still have traces of that in it too, which would be detrimental to the animal. So we want to look at management practices, how the straw was made as well, almost more so than how hay is made.
I had no idea. That's really good to know. So
My husband grain farms, so it's handy information.
Very handy information.
Anything else that we haven't touched on that you wanted to make sure we covered?
I think that pretty much covers it, unless you guys have any more questions.
I think that, I mean, that felt fantastic. Maybe I'll open it up to our listeners, and if any of you guys out there have more questions or anything that we didn't cover for Jana, maybe at some point we could do a little follow-up Q&A.
For sure. That would be fun.
Yeah. Okay. Well, in that case, ladies, I am so grateful, Jana, for you coming on the podcast. This was super fun and interesting. And
Thank you guys so much for having me.
yeah, it was a blast. So shall we wrap it up, Mira? What do you think?
I think that's a wrap.
If you want more Friends on Horses, you can find us on Facebook at Friends on Horses Podcast.
Check it out for all the latest and greatest horsey news.
You can find us on the web at friendsonhorsespodcast.com.
Or Instagram at friendsonhorses_podcast.
Like what you hear? Help us quit our hay jobs by supporting Friends on Horses. You can support us by rating our episodes on iTunes.
Becoming an ongoing sponsor through Patreon.
Or simply by spreading the word about our show.
Have some feedback?
We'd love to hear from you.
Contact us via email at friendsonhorses@gmail.com.
Thanks for joining us.
Until next time.